What's interesting is during Whitman's time, this was the perfect place for Newspaper Row, because you had City Hall here, you had Wall Street, the news places, and you had news coming in at South Street Seaport. That's where the boats would arrive with international news. Now later they discovered that the deeper water was on the other side of Manhattan, on the west side.
When the boats were heavier, more tonnage, you need that.
Right, and the news started coming in on that side, and of course the telegraph invention and the telephone changed things. But during Whitman's time, this was the place you could most easily gather the news and where the news was freshest.
And where, I mean, to say that City Hall is here and Wall Street is there, and the criminal courts are quite close as
well.
Right,
the Tombs was up there, the prison, so you had like, everything was really right over here.
So that the one smells the tabloids in some lines by Whitman. There are lines in which one feels that he was on the city beat.
Yeah.
And that murders, robberies, fires, scandals, as well as the great civic events of the day were on his blotter.
Printing House Square was over there too. It no longer exists now. It was a kind of a gathering place, park type thing when Whitman was around. That was also where Tammany Hall was based. And a lot of these newspapers, especially Walt with his emerging democratic vision, the democratic papers were of course gathered around Tammany Hall. And there was actually a drinking place called the Pewter Mug where Whitman would hang out with some of the politicos and the cronies and the newspaper men. So this was also part of his scene here.
It's so interesting to remember that then as now, journalists and politicians
it's true.
lived in one world, occupied the same social spaces.
They feed each other, right? That's such a truism.
But even as we're describing that kind of cross-fertilization that happens between journalism and politics, we are talking about a poet.
Right.
A poet
being born. Remember,
he's being born, and we don't necessarily think of poetry as incubating in journalism.
Right.
And yet, Walt Whitman reminds us of how many poets, right, begin as journalists, although perhaps none so thoroughly and magnificently as he does.
I mean, he's often described as the first real New York flaneur. You know,
Yes.
a walker in the city, sort of an observer that's inside and outside at the same time. So the reporting business was perfect for him.
Yes.
You know, he was the eye of New York.
And in that way, I'm so glad you brought up that term, flaneur. I mean, it's a term used for literary walkers in 19th century cities around the world.
And sort of a gay code too, right? The implication is that this is a dandy, someone who's sort of outside of sort of a traditional family.
Right, unattached.
Right.
With the freedom.
Right.
With the freedom to walk. We're also here at the center of what would have been newspaper culture in the 1840s.
And coming from there, this whole street, Nassau Street, and also Ann Street, which is the next street over, lots and lots of little papers. They called them penny dailies, right? Because there was this proliferation of very cheap 4-page newspapers in the 1840s, a penny a day. And it was just fun to be a reporter. There was a lot of opportunity to hop back and forth, and Whitman fully embraced this, right?
That's right. And what were the papers he worked on?
He accepts a job in March at the New York Aurora. And a month later, in the Aurora is published this little editorial piece saying, the Aurora is now the best paper in the country.
That's
and the editor
boy.
is the finest. It's definitely Walt's talking. But he was not there long. He was fired around May. And again, we think perhaps it was because of his very sort of offhand, irreverent approach to journalism. But some of the Aurora staff later wrote he was a slacker, that he would show up at work at 10 or 11, take a lunch break, ride the omnibus up and down Broadway and maybe do something later. So lots of temptation, as we've seen.
As we've already described, a city is a place where work and leisure, you know, someone running by, right? It's the middle of a work day. It's a place where work and leisure are ribboning, right, interpenetrating, interimplicated all the time.
This is such a good point about being urban, right? For a lot of urbanites, you don't need a destination. The journey through the streets is the destination, right?
Yes.
So you let things happen to you because things are always happening.
Yes.
And Whitman, you know, he
Why
uses...
isn't that journalism anyway?
Right.
You know? It could just be happening. Your lunch break is, you know, it is in a certain way your work time. And for a writer, what is the difference between downtime and uptime? That ideas are always incubating as you walk, as you loll, as you loaf, as he will later say, on the grass.
And he would also use this phrase, absorb and translate. And I feel like that's what a city person really does, right? You're going through and you can't take everything in, but you're sort of like sponging in all of these people, all of this activity, the park theater, the phrenological cabinet, where you're working, the competition, and you know, you translate it into yourself somehow. So he's really in and of the city.
Weave the song.
Right. And he really he builds himself here, right? Because after he gets fired from the Aurora, he immediately gets a job a couple of doors down at the Evening Tatler. And of course, one of the first things the Tatler publishes is a derogatory letter about the Aurora. And the Aurora has a rejoinder. So there's this camaraderie also, even if it's not always the most positive type of camaraderie.
That's right.
There are
That's
connections
right. Well,
that the city enables.
The controversies that are sparked by, say, an editor leaving for another paper become copy.
Right.
Right, and there's a kind of experimentation going on with how you make news and what is news. And so, also on this street were the New York Mirror.
The New York Mirror was here. The Democratic Review, which was one of the more prestigious of the Democratic papers, and in fact, the Democratic Review that same year, 1842, that we keep talking about here, publishes several of his short stories.
Yeah.
Those weirdo,
I have one.
Victorian, sensational, and I think it's a great exercise to read them and to realize that not all great writers are great writers at the beginning.
Time.
It's total schlock.
That's right. And
Potboiler stuff.
I have a Democratic Review in which Walt Whitman appears. And he's Walter there.
Right. He's not Walt Whitman yet.
He hasn't yet gotten the charisma that comes with, or doesn't yet think of himself in that way, whatever that way is.
That
goes with Walt.
Yeah, that was definitely with Leaves of Grass in '55 a real transformation of this man that was wandering these streets. He's a different person entirely. He's not a poet who's just born one day. You know, on these very streets where we're standing, where he walked with his black hat and his black outfit, he's putting together the idea of a new American poetry, right?
Yes.
A raw, radical, street-level poetry.
Yep.
And it emerges out of these buildings around us, the newspaper offices, the quirky phrenological cabinets and other things. That's all in that great amalgam that becomes Leaves of Grass.
Yes.
A little bit further up, and the building doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be at 131 Nassau Street. That was Fowler and Wells's phrenological cabinet.
What was that?
Yeah, I mean, what was it? It was a studio.
Yeah.
And they actually sold some books, although Fowler and Wells had a separate bookstore. A lot of people don't know that. That's where Leaves of Grass was actually sold. But in the cabinet, they conducted phrenological readings. And phrenology is one of these pseudosciences that's starting to simmer in the 1840s, an alternative to sort of different ways about thinking about your life and your psychology. Head bumps, right?
Okay, yeah, I would feel your head.
And if I had a bump somewhere, there was a chart that said, oh my gosh, you're smart, or you're more amative. You know, there was a whole vocabulary that Whitman really loved about these exams.
Yes.
And Whitman had his bumps read in the late 1840s, was so fond of his chart that he included it in the 1856 edition of Leaves of Grass.
I did not know that. And what did he particularly like about his chart?
Well, if you ask me, I think he changed some of the numbers because it looks almost too good.
Oh, really?
You know,
it says he's robust.
Yeah, he's robust.
Amative means sexually potent.
So one of the terms that was used in the phrenological charts was adhesiveness. A stickiness, right?
Right.
But for Whitman, this became gay code for same-sex affection.
Really?
And in general, that was what the feeling was when Fowler and Wells were doing the chart. It meant how well you would get along with your, with your friend. But Whitman took that term much further, especially in the Calamus poems. So this phrenology that was happening at Fowler and Wells was a really key part of the way he started developing his ideas of psychology.